Hi, I'm Jeric.
Hi, I'm Lorna.
We're going on a journey to discover the legacy of the American Legion
and how that history of the Legion is shaping the vision for our future.
Lorna, this is Jeric. Come in, over.
Ready to start Operation Disaster Preparedness.
Let's go ahead and get prepared. Over.
Let's do it.
All right.
Emergency response has been a natural function of the American Legion nearly since the organization's earliest years. Legionnaires of every war era have stepped into chaos to provide order, comfort, and assistance in the darkest times for communities, states, and the nation. By 1924, Legion posts in Indiana and Illinois had already responded to hurricanes and a deadly mine accident faster than anyone else in their communities. Throughout the decades, the American Legion family has rallied after floods, fires, storms, earthquakes, and the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Out of this tradition of quick, effective relief work came the Legion's National Emergency Fund in 1989 to assist victims and help post-rebuild after disasters. The NEF gave American Legion Emergency Response a stable funding source for a service the organization had been providing, one disaster at a time, for most of the century.
The American Legion raised over $250,000 in cash to support Red Cross relief efforts after massive floods on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in the winter of 1937. Also, during the flood of '37, Legionnaires from Jamestown, New York, sent a mobile radio unit to the devastated area to provide emergency communications, a service the organization continues to offer today through its National Ham Radio Club. Working with local communities, the Red Cross, and the Veterans Administration under its civil defense function, the Legion had established itself as a pillar of action and support during times of disaster. In February 1941, American Legion National Commander Milo J. Warner of Ohio flew to England to study civilian wartime defense during Germany's bombing raids. That visit laid the foundation of the American Legion's civil defense program, in time of attack or natural disaster, that other government agencies would later adopt. In 1942, the Legion's blood donor program was launched to help with the World War II effort. In time, the American Legion would become the nation's #1 donor of blood among organizations in the United States, an essential provision to save lives during disasters large and small, in times of war or peace. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, while businesses and other organizations that usually provide locations for blood donations are closed, American Legion posts around the country have stepped up to fill the gap. In conjunction with the Red Cross and other organizations in need of blood, Legion posts open their buildings to facilitate blood drives while respecting safe social distancing standards.
The American Legion continued to serve communities in hundreds of ways after catastrophes. On August 17, 1969, Hurricane Camille slammed into the Gulf Coast, killing 259 people, destroying communities and causing nearly $1.5 billion in damages. Dozens of American Legion posts were obliterated. The disaster led the American Legion to start a relief fund to provide $1,500 in cash for displaced veterans and grants of up to $5,000 for damaged posts. The concept behind the relief fund was summoned 20 years later when Hurricane Hugo howled into the U.S. Southeast and Caribbean on September 9, 1989, and a Northern California earthquake hit 5 weeks later on the eve of the Legion's National Executive Committee meetings. Tens of billions of dollars in damage occurred, thousands were injured, and nearly 100 people were killed. The NEC passed a resolution at the fall meetings to raise no less than $50,000 in seed money for a permanent $1 million endowment later to be called the National Emergency Fund. By the National Convention in August of 1990, more than $500,000 had been raised for the new NEF.
Through the 1990s, the NEF was there to help victims of storms, fires, and earthquakes. When the Red River flooded in 1997 in Minnesota and North Dakota, the American Legion's NEF distributed more than 800 cash grants totaling over $1 million. Then came Hurricane Katrina.
You know, we had never left the city for any storm. From the time I was born, we had some tough storms. I remember as a kid, I was 7 years old, and we had a storm in 1947 that was really devastating, but nothing like Katrina.
The storm on August 29, 2005, its surge and the floods that followed claimed more than 1,800 lives along the U.S. Gulf Coast and caused upwards of $125 billion in property damage. Just weeks after Katrina's devastation, Hurricanes Wilma and Rita tore into the Gulf Coast, compounding the catastrophe. Nearly $2 million in NEF grants were issued. American Legion posts across the Southeast were converted into relief stations and refugee camps. One in Louisiana was transformed into a kidney dialysis center. Amid the flooding and destruction, American Legion members rescued survivors, helped feed the hungry and homeless, and performed as they had throughout the history of the organization, stepping up in a time of crisis.
The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 gave the American Legion a complex opportunity to exercise its disaster relief muscle. Kim Lau, American Legion Post 1291 in New York City's Chinatown, provided relief support for emergency personnel searching for survivors after the attack on the World Trade Center. And when one New York City Police Department officer and military veteran, who had only recently become acquainted with the American Legion, received a call while he was searching for survivors at Ground Zero, he learned what the organization does in the darkest of times.
9/11 happened, and not only was there concern for myself and the other guys that they had met, but it was also, what do you need? What can we do? It must have been like two and a half hours later, you get a call. Sean, there's a truck at the gate looking for you, and found out that it was from one of the members of that American Legion post. And he had them, I don't know how he got it, but there was boxes upon boxes of respirators, and not only the cheap little ones, but I mean the really nice ones. Really nice respirators, and tons of gloves, work gloves. Anything from your regular garden glove to the real high-end work gloves, all leather. And it said, from your brothers and sisters, the American Legion post. What I saw from this post, from the guys in this post, was what I've come to find out is the norm of the Legion, not the exception. That's the norm of the Legion.
Over the years, the American Legion's disaster response mission has distinguished itself in some of the nation's most terrible times. Since the National Emergency Fund's formal establishment in 1989, it has distributed more than $10 million in direct cash assistance to veterans, Legion posts, and communities. The American Legion's disaster preparedness program today includes an amateur radio club of more than 3,000 ham operators equipped to provide emergency communications whenever called upon. The American Legion Amateur Radio Club is now one of the largest in the nation, having only been formally established since May of 2011. Floods, fires, tornadoes, earthquakes, and attacks have assumed many names and have occurred in many places. Throughout these crises, the American Legion has been a rock of stability, hope, and better times ahead, applying skills learned in the military, compassion, and teamwork to help communities recover.
The Legion stepped up, and it all seemed to come together, and it was a veterans helping veterans, but it was people helping people.